Welcome to today's webinar, Groundwater Making the Invisible Visible on World Water Day and every day. I'm Liz Kirkwood, Executive Director of FLOW, for Love of Water. FLOW is located on lands historically occupied by the Three Fires Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. We are grateful to these sovereign nations for sustaining their sacred waters since time immemorial, and are humbled to be a partner in protecting the Great Lakes watershed for future generations. We invite all to honor the first guardians of the water we love by incorporating Anishinaabeg's water ethic and traditional ecological knowledge into our individual and collective relationships with water. Before we turn to today's conversation, I'd like to provide a brief overview of FLOW's groundwater program in the Michigan Groundwater Table. Our mission is to ensure that the waters of the Great Lakes are healthy. FLOW's work provides pathways and policy solutions for all people in the Great Lakes. Residents, communities, businesses, tribes, and officials to assert our rights and responsibilities in relationship to the water. Groundwater is vital to our mission because it connects with and feeds surface water, which is protected by the public trust doctrine. Moreover, the Great Lakes can never be fully restored and healthy unless the groundwater that feeds them is fully protected. We are proud of our multi-year commitment to our groundwater program to educate all stakeholders on the importance and value of groundwater and to drive protective and holistic public policy changes. FLOW's work to strengthen the protection of groundwater is made possible in part by generous support from the Americana Foundation and the Lupin Foundation. We are grateful. In a 2016 report prepared by scientists under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, the author said, quote, "Groundwater being out of sight remains an enigma to many people, including those who rely on it for their water supplies," unquote. That is one reason why groundwater policies have been piecemeal, resulting in fragmented protections that expose this freshwater resource to continued degradation and future public health risks. Protective policies and law continue to lag behind modern scientific understanding about the threats to groundwater and its vital importance to all life uses and communities in a watershed. Without rivers on fire and catastrophic oil spills, groundwater emergencies remain invisible and have failed to capture the hearts and minds of our lawmakers and the public. Michigan should remedy that by leading with smart policies and solutions to finally address the grave public health risks from toxic chemicals, agricultural pollutants, and failing septic systems. The good news is that despite being overlooked for decades, groundwater is finally taking the driver's seat in 2022 as multiple public interest organizations, philanthropy, academia, government, and businesses promote a deeper understanding of the source of drinking water for 145 million Americans and approximately 4.5 million Michiganders. This momentum gives us hope to protect this invisible resource vital to sustaining the health of the Great Lakes. Today's session will offer perspectives on the critical importance of our groundwater resources, as well as the work of the Michigan Groundwater Table, which was convened by FLOW. The Groundwater Table is made up of 22 knowledgeable and influential stakeholders from local government, academia, regulatory agencies, and public interest and justice organizations focused on the state of Michigan's groundwater, the source of drinking water for 45% of Michigan's population. The Groundwater Table has agreed groundwater needs to be elevated as a state public policy priority for the long-term Great Lakes protection. Today, as I already mentioned, is World Water Day, which has been celebrated by the United Nations since 1993. This year's theme is groundwater, making the invisible visible, and it's the first time celebrating groundwater. In a water-dependent world of increasing water scarcity, competition, pollution, and climate change, Protecting every arc of the water cycle, including groundwater, must be our priority. Water is life, and for the 4th year in a row, Representative Padma Koopa is introducing a Michigan Water Day resolution on World Water Day to mark this global day of observance of water as a basic and crucial human need. It is my great honor to introduce State Representative Padma Koopa, who is serving her 2nd term in the Michigan House of Representatives, representing Michigan's 41st House District, which encompasses the cities of Troy and Clawson. Prior to this, her career as an engineer and project manager spanned the automotive, financial, and IT industries. Koopa has also been a civic leader, volunteering with the PTA, founding the Troy Area Interfaith Group, and serving on Troy's Planning Commission and Zoning Board. She is the first Indian immigrant and Hindu in the Michigan legislature. Welcome, Representative.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Liz. It is an honor to be here. As you mentioned, I'm an engineer. There are many scientists who are working alongside me in the legislature. Representative Rachel Hood in the Grand Rapids area, Representative Lori Pahutsky in the southern Metro Detroit area. We recently, along with floor leader of the Democratic Caucus, Yusuf Rabi, introduced a set of bills about making sure that our groundwater is a public trust. My love of water dates back to my Hindu tradition that values water as a sacred element, but it also is based on life experience. And when I was 15, after living in the United States for 11 years, my parents had gotten their higher education here. My father's a PhD in English. My mother's a PhD in molecular biology. They decided to go back to India when I was 15. And I was horrified because I could not open the tap and drink water. And that gave me such an understanding of what people around the world have experienced without good, clean water access, safe access to clean water. I see there are a number of people who are in the chat saying hello. It is really good to be here with all of you and talking about the importance of water, because I came to the Great Lakes state to make cars, but I stayed for the lakes. We have the best freshwater system in the world here. And so I see it as my dharma, my duty, my responsibility to lift my voice. And I was very fortunate when I began knocking doors in 2018. You know, what does an engineer know about running for office? Well, I took classes and they told me I had to go door knocking. And so when I started knocking doors, it was amazing to hear from so many people in my district who then became my constituents, how much they also value water. And so this is something that I've seen, that many of us across the state realize the importance and want to do something. And we must have leaders who value the water, whether it's the groundwater, the Great Lakes, or the water infrastructure, that we must continue to invest in our infrastructure so that what happened in Flint doesn't happen anywhere else, so that the water shutoffs that were happening, that are continuing to happen in Detroit, don't happen to anyone. This is really important to me. I want to take a minute, though, to read from the resolution itself. I will be speaking today, as I have every year, about the importance of the World Water Day resolution and about the importance of recognizing water, not just today, but every day. But I want to read to you because I really appreciate, for love of water, for your leadership, and for everyone who's involved with these organizations that advocate on water, but especially with Liz, who has been a kindred spirit on advocating. So I want to just read a portion of it for you before turning it back to all of you to talk about this very important topic. Whereas Michigan's groundwater is a critical and often overlooked resource, providing drinking water to 45% of Michigan's population, as well as water for agricultural and job creating manufacturing uses. Whereas groundwater flow to surface water is important to cold water fisheries, to stream ecology and wetlands, and can also account for up to 25% of the total water inflow to the Great Lakes via groundwater inflow into tributaries. Whereas Michigan has underinvested in monitoring, mapping, and reporting of groundwater quantity and quality, whereas despite the abundance of Michigan's groundwater, localized withdrawals have caused conflicts and fostered water quality problems. Whereas Michigan's groundwater quality has substantially deteriorated over the last century, leading to more than 24,000 contamination sites and thousands of contaminated private wells. I want to stop there. Please go look for this Water Day resolution. I'll put the link in there. It is resolution number 256. A math person like me likes the fact that it's 2 to the power of 8. And so it's a fun number. I think it's really important that you recognize who are the people that actively sought to co-sponsor it with me. But I know that every year I ask that it be put on the electronic keyboard. So check back to see who else has co-sponsored this resolution. I don't see anyone not supporting it. Every time that I've introduced it, we've all acknowledged it, but we really need to continue to remind people across the state, across the aisle, that it is very important that we protect our sacred water. Thank you so much for having me.
Representative Koopa, I just want to thank you so much for your incredible leadership and your tireless effort to protect water for all in Michigan. And I hope that we see the unanimous support for your resolution as you successfully achieved last year with House Resolution 57. Thank you. And now it is my honor now to introduce our moderator, Skip Kress, who's an attorney and energy consultant and co-founder of 5 Lakes Energy, LLC. Skip was director of the Michigan Department of Energy, Labor, and Economic Growth and Michigan's chief energy officer, and also served as Governor Granholm's special advisor for renewable energy and environment. Prior to that, Skip was the deputy director of the Department of Environmental Quality. He now serves as senior legal advisor to Flow. And Skip is just a treasure to work with. So passing it over to you, Skip. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I'll get right at it. In Michigan, we are long overdue in directing sufficient attention to Michigan's underappreciated groundwater resources, what David Dempsey aptly calls our 6th Great Lake. Groundwater should not and cannot be ignored. As Liz said, 45% of Michigan's citizens are dependent on groundwater for their water supply, and 1.3 million Michigan households have private wells. So given our dependence on groundwater, we are presently woefully ill-equipped to deal with existing known groundwater problems. We have chemical and petroleum groundwater contamination at literally thousands of sites around the state. We have microbial contamination from substandard septic systems. We have nutrient loadings from agriculture that elevate nitrates in water. As Liz indicated, there is some good news. We are finally focusing on groundwater issues. Flow has been active in 3 areas to make the invisible visible. David Dempsey has authored 2 groundwater reports that have really catalyzed broader interest and concern about groundwater. We have the work of the Flow established Michigan Groundwater Table, which we're illustrating today. And then lastly, Flow is also working with Michigan State University on a 2-year project to evaluate the existing risk management strategies for preventing exposure to contaminated groundwater. So today on World Water Day, we have 4 brief presentations that will broadly outline where we are on some key groundwater issues, followed by a discussion. I want to welcome and introduce our panel of presenters. As I said, we have four. The first is Dr. Ellen Steinman. He is the Ellen and Helen Hunting Director of Grand Valley State University's Annis Water Resources Institute and author of over 180 published scientific books, chapters, and articles relating to water quality and water policy. Ellen also recently organized a groundwater summit that resulted in a number of consensus recommendations. Our second speaker will be David Hamilton. David has 34 years experience managing water resources programs in the Michigan Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Environmental Quality, now EGLE, and as Senior Policy Director for the Nature Conservancy. David is an active member of Michigan's Water Use Advisory Committee, which we will hear more about. Our third speaker is Andy Hogarth, who spent his 40-year career with the Michigan Departments of Natural Resources and Environmental Quality, and he retired as the chief of DEQ's Remediation and Redevelopment Division. He currently serves as an advisor to Flow. And then our last speaker will be Josh Mosier, who is the acting director of the Remediation and Redevelopment Division at EGLE. Josh has over 15 years of experience in the environmental field, including 11 years as the chief of the Compliance and Enforcement section of the Remediation and Redevelopment Division. So Ellen, you're up first. Ellen will provide an overview of the challenges we face in understanding groundwater and what we should be doing to improve our oversight and stewardship of groundwater resources.
Thank you, Skip. I appreciate the introduction, and it's an honor to be part of this with my co-panelists. So what I'd like to start with is talk about some of the grand challenges facing groundwater in Michigan, some of which we have already heard from the preceding speakers. But first of all, there needs to be a better public understanding of what groundwater actually is. There's still a perception out there that that was promulgated by Jules Verne long ago, that our groundwater exists as these underground lakes and rivers. And in fact, we know that the groundwater is actually the water moisture and part water between the part of soil particles and in the fissures of our bedrock. So it exists in a very different format than I think a lot of the public perceives. In addition, we lack a statewide groundwater monitoring program. Could you imagine trying to host a business that didn't understand its stocks and flows? It wouldn't last very long. And yet here we have this critical resource, natural resource, that we don't have a good handle on its stocks and flows. Also, although there's a lot of information that's being generated about groundwater around the state, it's not coordinated. It's in different silos, different entities, different organizations, and it needs to be put into a more cohesive format. The water withdrawal assessment tool that was generated back in 2006 by the Groundwater Conservation Advisory Council was meant to be a screening tool, and it's still being used today without that refinement that was recommended as part of the original proposals when we sent that our report to the legislature. And although we are recognizing the scope of the problems associated with groundwater, the reality is there are many unrepresented sectors that we have not yet tapped into to get their input on what's important to them regarding groundwater. So as a part of that summit that Skip referred to, shown here at the bottom, and if people are interested in getting more information about that summit, the report or the peer-reviewed scientific publication, they're welcome to contact me about that. We came up with a number of technical and non-technical recommendations. This categorization is an artificial one. They kind of bleed together, but for the purposes of this presentation, I've separated them. And they feed on what those general issues that I just outlined were. One, we need to improve our public education and outreach efforts so people's understanding of groundwater become more rigorous. One way to do that is to create new information and visualization tools. Groundwater is complicated. It exists in 3 dimensions, and there's great opportunity using new technology and visualization tools to help illustrate and animate exactly how groundwater moves and exists in its invisible format, as we've been talking about. Also, as I mentioned, we need to be reaching out into the underrepresented communities and getting their feedback so that we have a more broad-based perspective on what the needs and desires are regarding this critical resource. And again, as Skip mentioned, Dave's a member of the Water Use Advisory Council, and it can be an important advocate for groundwater in Michigan because it represents a number of different sectors. I'm sure we'll hear more from Dave about that. And then finally, one of the real challenges we face in a water-rich state is to instill the importance of water conservation. How do you convince people to conserve water when they can see 4 Great Lakes around them? We'll talk a little more about that in a second. So from a technical perspective, and again, this classification is a little artificial, we need to develop this statewide groundwater budget and a monitoring program that focuses not just on quantity, but also on quality, because we do have these contaminants that Skip referred to. When we have all this information being generated, it needs to be coordinated. It needs to be put into some kind of information management system so that it's available to everybody and in an easy, user-friendly format. We need an early warning system. We need to be proactive about these issues, not reactive about these issues as we've been in the past. So we need to understand what that might mean, and it might take a couple of different avenues, and I'll talk about that in a couple of bullets. Improving the water use program and the water withdrawal assessment tool. As I mentioned earlier, it's been a screening tool, but perhaps we should now elevate that and amplify it by having an interactive decision-making tool that's based on near real-time groundwater monitoring data and enhanced geologic mapping data, which the Michigan Geological Survey is doing right now, but we need to have statewide 3-dimensional data. So when we look at all of these issues, we have sort of a poster child here in Ottawa County in terms of the groundwater crisis that's facing the state. And in particular, in the middle part of the county, Robinson Township, Allendale Township, and Olive Township, and Blendon Township have been facing this groundwater crisis for over the last 50 years. If we look at the static water level in the middle part of the county, and static water level is simply the water level in the wells when the pumps are turned off. In some of these regions, it's dropped 40 to 50 feet over the last 50 years, an enormous drop in water levels. And what this has done is wells have been going deeper and deeper. They're starting to draw from the Marshall Formation, which sits on an ancient seabed, and it's drawing chloride concentrations up into these wells. And if we look at this map on the right, developed by Zach Curtis and his co-authors at Michigan State, if we look in the background here, this amoeba-like colors, this is representing the amount of water, static water level that's been drawn down. The warmer the colors, the greater the drawdown. And here you can see 45 to 50 feet or 15 meters in the middle part near Blendon and Olive Townships. And then superimposed on this are these dots, which represent the amount of chloride concentration that's being drawn up from the deeper aquifers that sit on ancient seabeds. The state has a threshold of 250 milligrams per liter or parts per million, but many of these dots represent 250 or above in these areas, which now are representing an ecological threat to this region and also a threat to agriculture that's using this water to irrigate the farms in this region. So we have this double whammy occurring with respect to quantity and quality, and Ottawa County is not alone. We have other counties, particularly in the Thumb, that are facing similar issues. So we need to be vigilant about these kinds of problems. They're emerging, they're becoming more prevalent, and having the kinds of resources that we're talking about available today, developing the tools, developing the coordinated management systems, and developing the monitoring program will help us to protect this resource in the future. Thank you very much. Back to you, Skip.
Alan, thank you so much for that. Michigan has so many critical needs relating to groundwater. And who would have imagined that we have counties within the state being so water rich that have critical groundwater issues.
Indeed.
So our next speaker will be David Hamilton, and this is apt. David will provide a brief overview of the opportunities we may have to greatly improve groundwater modeling, data gathering, and improving our overall understanding of Michigan groundwater resources, just the things that Ellen had pointed to. David, thank you.
Thank you, Skip. So I'll start with describing what the Water Use Advisory Council is. It is a successor group to what Alan described briefly. It represents a wide range of stakeholders, environmental groups, business, agriculture, lake and stream associations, utilities, and local government. The members are appointed by the governor and by legislative leaders. It's their goal to provide advice to these leaders on the water withdrawal assessment process. And this process was developed became live back in 2009, and it is nationally recognized as an innovative approach to prevent adverse resource impacts in Michigan streams from large quantity withdrawals. And the analysis is based on environmental metrics. It combines surface and groundwater models and fish response models to assess the potential impacts of water withdrawals. So this program, as it began in 2009, it was based on data that was available in 2006 and 2007. Since then, new technology has become available and that didn't exist then. And it's critical for us to develop and define and understand our groundwater resources. And this requires more data and more models. So it's critical to keep this program up to date and based on up-to-date science. So the Water Use Advisory Council has made the following recommendations because of this: to update the process with new technologies, to gather more data, both hydrologic and geologic, to create what's called the Michigan Hydrologic Framework. This would facilitate the creation of models to evaluate impacts on water resources. It would share hydrologic data and analysis and develop smart maps, which would make hydrologic data more accessible to not only professionals, but the general public. It would describe the distribution, abundance, and status and trends of linked atmosphere, surface, and groundwater databases. It would create an integrated water management database, and as Alan pointed to, currently data is scattered all over the place. There are databases in many, many locations, and they're also located in many file cabinets, still paper copies. It would advance water conservation and develop water user committee manuals. Now, as we consider groundwater, as it's been noticed, it's invisible. And we can't see the groundwater, we can't see the geologic matrix that the groundwater moves through. We gather the information through small discrete points, wells, and also we can gather information where the groundwater seeps into surface water. To be able to evaluate this information, it's critical that we have tools, and models are the types of tools that are useful to help us understand how the hydrologic system behaves. And it's the only way that we can make predictions as to how it will respond to changing stresses, whether these stresses are increased pumpage or changing precipitation patterns. So when we look at this graphic, we start with the real world and we gather information from that real world and we put it into a GIS, geographic information system, so it becomes accessible digitally for modeling, but things from aquifer properties, stratigraphy, topography, channel data, hydrography, watershed boundaries, soils, and land use, just a whole matrix of information that can be available. And then that is used to create models to simulate the complex reality that's out there. And so this graphic shows a three-dimensional model, which have been developed. We can also interface it with atmospheric models and interface groundwater models with surface water models. So these are all very important features that would go into this Michigan Hydrologic Framework. Now, this information, this type of work will be able to benefit many programs and the people of the state of Michigan. So that if we look at enhancing our modeling capabilities, if we look at increased data collection, both hydrologic and geologic, and we improve data accessibility, it's going to help us out in a number of things, including protecting the groundwater quality and drinking water supplies, designing and evaluating the resiliency of critical public infrastructure to water extremes, floods, and droughts, protecting the aquatic ecosystems from adverse resource impacts, and protecting property from flood damage. So we're trying to move forward to move not only what's used in the water withdrawal assessment process, but what's used statewide in many programs and helpful to many programs. That's what the recommendations will do from the council. It's before the legislature now, and I appreciate having the time to share this with you.
Thank you, David. That was very helpful. It is, you know, it's a good thing. We may see the legislature actually act and provide funding, and indeed funding may be likely to allow us to implement the recommendations of the Water Use Advisory Council, and better data is going to yield better decision making. It's an investment in science that we really need, and I'm sure is very long overdue. I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions of our speakers, of our presenters, just to put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the webpage. Our next speaker will be Andy Hogarth. Andy will provide a brief history of our state's oversight of sites of groundwater contamination.
Thank you,
Andy?
Skip. There are thousands of known groundwater contamination sites spread throughout the state. The scope of these problems range from relatively small areas where leaked chemicals and contaminated groundwater flow in shallow zones into utility corridors or storm sewers, to aquifers with contaminant plumes that travel for miles, impacting drinking water supply wells and venting to surface waters. Sources are myriad, from commercial, industrial, and agricultural operations, both public and private, even residential. And small quantities of hazardous substances like gasoline or TCE can make enormous quantities of groundwater unfit to drink. 5 gallons of TCE can make a billion gallons of groundwater unsafe to drink. So small operations can cause multi-million-dollar problems. The map on the right side of this slide shows how they're distributed throughout the state, each dot representing one site, but not representing the size of the groundwater contamination plume, some of which stretch for miles, like the Wicks manufacturing plume shown in the lower left of the slide. This TCE plume stretches northwest from Mansalona in Antrim County all the way to Shanty Creek and is headed towards Lake Belair. The parties that cause these problems should pay to fix them. However, when the liable parties are unknown, have few assets, or are bankrupt, the costs fall on the public. Public funds are allocated to sites based upon the seriousness of the hazards they pose. Many liable parties are also recalcitrant, and the state must use public funds to address urgent hazards and gather evidence. Millions are spent by the state every year just providing replacement water supplies to people whose wells have become contaminated. Many sites are what we term legacy sites and will require decades and cost more than $100 million each to adequately remedy. Site cleanup requirements are based upon risk. The risk-based system depends on a thorough assessment of the extent of soil and groundwater contamination and the risk posed to public health and the environment through a number of potential exposure pathways. For groundwater, the primary pathways are drinking water, volatilization to indoor air, and venting to surface water. For soil, the criteria include potential impact on groundwater due to leaching. For hundreds of hazardous substances, pathway-specific generic cleanup criteria have been developed, which represent the safe concentrations for likely exposures associated with residential land use. For a remedy to be approved, the soil and groundwater must achieve the generic criteria. For residential use, unless reliable land use restrictions are put in place to assure acceptable exposures do not occur. Use restrictions are most commonly deed restrictions or municipal ordinances. An important element of any remedial action must be aggressive source control, such as removal or containment of released product in heavily contaminated soil. For example, gasoline floating on the water table or soil saturated with chlorinated solvents. If such source material is not removed or contained, contaminant plumes will grow and ultimate cleanup costs will escalate. In Michigan, for non-leaking underground storage tank sites, cleanup is primarily regulated by Part 201 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. Between 2010 and 2018, a number of Part 201 amendments were enacted that significantly weakened the program. Many of these amendments were written by the regulated community, and objections from MDEQ staff were ignored. 3 of these changes are especially significant. Number 1, a new definition of source that defines source as a container or equipment from which the release originally occurred. Consider the photo at the bottom of the slide. It shows a portion of the more than 20,000 55-gallon drums dumped on the ground by Hooker Chemical Company in Muskegon County. These drums were filled with extremely toxic waste, hauled to the back of the property, and split open with an axe to allow the contents to flow out. You can see the black ooze on the ground between the drums. Defining source as the container from which the release originally occurred serves no legitimate public purpose It only serves to make liable party cleanups more contentious, slower, less effective, and more costly in the long run. Number two, limiting the ability of the department to use the best available science when determining the toxicity of hazardous substances. The photo on the right is of groundwater from a deep well to the Ott Story site, also in Muskegon County. This groundwater contains dozens of toxic chemicals, and yet the department is now restricted in its ability to use best available science in determining the appropriate cleanup criteria for such groundwater. And third, a much more permissive approach to the application of use restrictions, which has led to claims that it is not necessary to do any cleanup if the local unit of government is willing to extend a water distribution system into the affected area. With that, I'll turn it back to Skip.
Thank you, Andy. That is very sobering. Josh Mosier will now provide a brief overview on the status of Michigan's current efforts to manage and prioritize remedial action at sites of groundwater contamination, the current status of the programs that Josh and his colleagues are administering. Take it away, Josh.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you. So I'm not going to dwell on the problems. I'm going to talk about again our current status and what I believe Eagle and RD need to do to move the progress forward. So go to the next slide. The main two parts of RD's programs to manage sites of contamination are twofold. We perform those state-funded actions at sites where there are no responsible parties available to do the work. So, in Michigan, we do have a lot of legacy contamination. We find groundwater contamination today that we can trace back 50 to almost 100 years ago. And a lot of those liable parties no longer exist, have gone bankrupt or just dissolved. And that's really where the taxpayers and Eagle have to pick up the ball. And we also have to do our compliance efforts to hold the liable parties responsible for the releases that they have to the environment. So we do need adequate staffing to perform oversight of responsible party actions, take those enforcement actions. Yes, polluters should pay. As Andy said, that's the intent of the legislation. But again, they're not always around. There's many orphan sites out there. We estimate there's probably 50% of the 24,000 sites are orphaned, based on what we work on today. So along with having adequate resources to address the legacy contamination and hold current parties responsible, there are key program improvements we think are necessary to more aggressively go after contamination, hopefully abate the risk, not only just abate the risk, but control it better, make sure that groundwater plumes aren't as persistent and do not migrate. And I'll talk about those in another slide. So if we go to the next slide, this kind of gives you a snapshot of just what we're doing in FY22 alone. We have $163 million allocated to 472 sites across the state, where our project managers are actively doing investigations, taking mitigation measures, trying to abate risks to the public, understand the risks and the pathways that Andy described to get those under control. And that represents only 2% of all of these sites. So again, when you talk about the resources needed, just to address the legacy contamination in orphan sites, it's significant. So I just wanted to give you an example here. This is the type of work we do. This is a former dry cleaner. It went bankrupt in 2016. When the county went in to look at the property, the tax reverted to see if they could redevelop it. They did their due diligence and found some contamination. So they called us and brought us on board. And it turns out the contamination was significant. They had used perchloroethylene for dry cleaning as a dry cleaning solvent. It had leaked from the facility. It had gone down. We didn't know at the time it was in operation, but through investigations, we found that it had gone into the sanitary sewer. The sanitary sewer ran between some of these residential properties, and there was a breach in the sewer and it leaked out. And so, to date, we've had to put in vapor intrusion mitigation systems from these volatile chemicals to protect the residents and the housings. We've done a couple $1 million of excavation to get rid of the grossly contaminated source material, not just on the property, but on the adjacent properties. And, there's a lot of money that goes into cleaning up. Again, this was a one-shop deal, not a large manufacturing. It was just a dry cleaner, few $1 million. And it's going to remain a facility. It's going to remain on the list. There's groundwater contamination that still exists. We have to manage and monitor those risks over time. We're not able to get all of the soil contamination out that has spread off-site. So we're going to have to continue to run some of these mitigation systems. So again, while we do an aggressive cleanup here, there's still long-term risk management that has to happen. And again, this is a large level of effort that that's still going to take long-term risk management, but we can't take this level of effort at every site. I mean, this is, again, almost $3 million over the last 3 years. And if we threw $1 million at each site every year, you can do the math in your head. That's just the sites we work on. That would be $400 million. We don't have that level of funding, let alone enough for thousands of sites. So we're doing our best. The more we can do state-funded work, the better. But that's just part of the picture. So what do we need to do to improve the program? So, like Andy said, there's been a lot of changes to Part 201, especially over the past decade or so. And, we have to be able to allow Eagle to rely upon the best available information to develop cleanup criteria. We know, because we've run the numbers, that if we develop the cleanup criteria in accordance with the amendments that were made in 2018, we would go backwards in our protectiveness. We'd be relying on outdated toxicity information for chemicals that just we don't believe are the best for public health. We have to try to redefine this source control or encourage responsible parties to do more source control, so the contaminant plumes do not remain in the environment and they're not persistent and they're smaller and don't migrate off-site. Because those are long-term liabilities that not only we have as citizens of the state, but the corporations that cause this. That's a long-term liability that they have to maintain and control. So if we can somehow convince people to redefine that, rethink how they look at source control in the long term and what's best for everybody as a whole, we have to do that. And then we have to put some timeframes around these activities. Right now, the main cleanup statute, Part 201, doesn't have adequate timeframes that are reliable that the department can use to enforce. It has language called diligently pursuing response activities to satisfy criteria. And again, satisfying criteria can mean restricting the resource so there's not an exposure control. But there's not a good cadence to how this program is supposed to work, what you're supposed to achieve by what time in the process. So a lot of these efforts kind of drag on over the years. So to put some definition around that may help us get to these sources a lot earlier, and prevent the spread and discover them and get on top of them before they become larger issues. And the last one, is to ensure that we're using these institutional controls such as deed restrictions and ordinances that restrict our resources only when necessary, and with everybody's full knowledge and buy-in that this is what is necessary. Maybe you can't get to the contamination. Maybe it's going to take a while for it to clean up, so you have to protect people in the interim, and maybe that's what we should use them for. But we should look at them again and see, are we doing the right thing here? I know there's the study out there on that that impact of restricting our resources, and I just see it as a way to we need to encourage people to only use them when necessary. Try to clean things up. You don't want to have to monitor this and operate systems in perpetuity. And right now, the program is in a state of long-term risk management, kind of in perpetuity, when we really should be having more targeted cleanups to prevent the long-term impacts of this groundwater contamination. And with that, I will say thank you.
Josh, thank you. That's a sobering presentation. 24,000 sites, I think you said, and clearly, as a state, we don't have the resources to attend to those sites. So we are, in fact, transferring the responsibility, the potential health and environmental impacts, and financial responsibility to our children and their children, given the number of sites that we have and the resources that we have to attend to it. One question that we've had, and actually by several people, they're asking, and this, Josh, to you and or Andy, if I'm a homeowner or a property owner or a local official in a community, how do I become aware of the proximate sites of environmental contamination and any risk that it may pose to me, my property, or my community?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple things that we have out there. One thing that we started, when Andy was our chief, was trying to map out where we have these institutional controls on groundwater where it's restricted for use, or it'll tell you that these restrictions are in place. And so we have that. It's in the link. It's called the Environmental Mapper. It's a GIS platform where you can go on there. Unless you're used to GIS, it's a little cumbersome. I think we need to streamline its effectiveness a little bit. The other thing that we have out there is called the Inventory of Facilities. And we provided that as well, where you can look up sites of contamination by program, by address. And that's where we pulled up the map that Andy showed today. All the green dots come from the inventory of facilities. All the red dots were the 472 sites where active work is going on. So you can pull that up. And sometimes the best way is just to call, and I didn't put this link up there and I apologize, maybe we can post it somewhere, is the district office for Eagle and RD, and talk to a project manager for your area and say, this is where I am and what's around me. So we have that. Andy and I have talked, and I know everybody's a big proponent of this too, is it would be nice to have groundwater plumes mapped. But out of the list of 24,000, I can't say definitively that those are all groundwater issues. They vary. We get reports in all the time when people do due diligence on properties when they buy property, and some of it's just some minor soil contamination and other things like that. So, but that is data intensive and cumbersome. We do site by site, GIS mapping to understand plumes and plumes over time. But to really map plumes and the different aquifers we have would be beneficial, but that would take dedicated resources and some partnerships and some commitments to get that done. So again, we have our inventory of facilities where you can look up all the facilities, and we do have our environmental mapper where you can see where institutional controls do restrict resources, including groundwater.
Thank you, Joshua. Andy, anything to add in that regard? You're on mute, Andy?
Sorry, Josh covered it sufficiently.
All right, so David or Ellen, it looks like the recommendations of the Water Use Advisory Council have a chance of being funded. How would this new scientific capacity in terms of modeling and data gathering, how will that help us understand the sites of contamination that we have, and importantly, mitigate the health and environmental risks to, to populations that these sites pose?
Well, the things that are in the proposal and hopefully will be funded is that it will increase the amount of data collected, which is critical. The hydrologic, the geologic, and the general groundwater data. It'll put data in centralized systems, which is also very critical. That will help facilitate data analysis, will facilitate the creation of models. And again, models are critical to understanding how the groundwater system works and how it's going to respond to various potential solutions. It will also facilitate the sharing of analysis and models. And through the smart map part of this proposal, it will allow interested people as well as professionals to better understand the groundwater in their area. So it's going to make information, data more readily available, and it'll make models easier to create and to use.
Ellen, in your view, what are the priority areas where we need to fill in the informational gaps, and what are our most acute data needs?
I think Dave covered it pretty well in terms of what they are, in terms, getting our three-dimensional mapping in place, understanding where the hot spots are, and modeling where we can identify where potential future issues are going to be, so we be proactive instead of reactive. But even with all the best, and believe me, I'm a strong advocate for all of the improved information gathering needs and technological advances. But until we have a better integration with the social dimension here, in terms of humans using that information, getting the legislation passed in order to incorporate this, and working with the communities to implement it, we're still going to be, we'll be better informed, but it doesn't mean we're going to be better stewards of our resource. So we really need to bring the human dimension into this as well.
And that would be, what are the elements of bringing in the human dimension that would actually be helpful? I mean, education, obviously, engagement, public engagement on these issues. I mean, we do have an abiding consensus in the Midwest, particularly in Michigan, being in the heart of the Great Lakes system, that, Republicans, Democrats, all are concerned about water quality, water quantity issues. We all want to be good stewards. So, how do we actually become better stewards?
I'm not sure, Skip, quite honestly. I think we've all been grappling with that for a long time. But certainly the first step is becoming better educated, so we understand what the dimensions are. So hopefully we can, follow the kind of advice that Josh gives, so that, we don't have to impose regulation on everybody to do the right thing. And education and communication is the first step in making that happen.
Mm-hmm. So, Andy, I know you know about this because you were there at the time, but we have a lot of orphan sites, meaning sites where we don't have responsible parties who are financially responsible and legally responsible to address the contamination. But back in the 90s, we had legislation that weakened the liability scheme, resulting in fewer liable parties. So, with fewer liable parties, then there's less people to attend to cleaning up these sites. Would it be your recommendation that we try to expand the universe of liable parties?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't thought much about it. It's probably worth looking at to see if there's a reasonable way to do that. I don't know if we could ever be successful in accomplishing it in our legislative climate. Absent that, though, it just means we need more and more public funding to deal with the sites.
Okay, want to go into another area. Of course, you know, as I said, Michigan is the Great Lakes state. We're at the heart of the largest, most extraordinary, most valuable fresh surface water system in the world. And yet there's this tragic irony that we are the only state of 50 that don't set minimum statewide standards for septic systems. We leave that up to local government. So can someone speak to the inadequacy and the impact of having inadequate and substandard and sometimes non-existent septic systems operating within the state without statewide legislation?
Well, from an ecological perspective, Skip, obviously not maintaining your septic systems has the potential to increase the nutrient flows into the groundwater and into the lakes, that if these are lakefront households that we're dealing with. And those nutrients will stimulate algal blooms, potentially harmful algal blooms as well. And if, you know, even if they're not getting into our surface waters, they're getting into our groundwater. And then you have pathogen issues that are associated with that and consequent health issues. So, you know, I think it's a tragedy. I agree with you that we don't regulate them, we don't maintain them, that people assume without sort of pumping that they're going to continue to operate efficiently over time. Again, part of that is education, and part of that is having a state. I believe we definitely need a statewide standard for dealing with the septic systems, because we see these problems continue to grow. More and more of our inland lakes are becoming susceptible to harmful algal blooms, and they're lasting longer through the seasons due to climate change. And because septic systems and groundwater are difficult to monitor, unlike surface waters, it gets back to this whole question of invisibility. And we don't know that it's a problem until we start sampling it. So we definitely need some standards in place from an ecological perspective.
Josh, are there other concerns about septic systems? You know, household chemical usage. PFAS suddenly was, large on our horizon all of a sudden a couple of years ago. What are some other concerns regarding the use and operation of septic systems that you see?
Yeah, sure, Skip. I'm no expert on septic systems and how they should operate necessarily, but what we do see is, especially in the PFAS world, because those health-based criteria are in the parts per trillion, they're pretty low, and it's we're seeing it pretty ubiquitous across the state in groundwater. We are seeing it actually in locations and in residential wells, whereas there's no other identified source than coming out of the septic system due to just the consumer products and household products that contain PFAS and other chemicals and hazardous substances like 1,4-dioxane. It's not uncommon for us to see that in shallower wells, in the parts per trillion and the low parts per billion flowing through. I don't know if it has to do with the failure of the systems or just they're not designed to handle hazardous chemicals, but we do see it, and it does concern us because it does take away resources, from looking into that stuff to determine, was there something here that had a release, and then you look and look and look, and no, there's nothing else in the area. It's just it's just from normal everyday consumer use, and it just leaches into the environment. And so, yeah, we do see those as an issue.
Thank you. So the questions are coming in. So David, what can you say more about the Michigan hydraulic framework? What are the barriers to putting it in place, and what is the current status of the framework?
Well, the current status is that it is a proposal. So the proposal, there's a lot of thought that's gone into it, and it's very doable. So there are no technological reasons that we can't do it. it's strictly a matter of funding. So if we can get the funding, get the right team together, I think we can put this thing together. The proposal is for 3 years to put it together and to roll it out. So I think that will be very, very good. Part of our proposal is also to do some regional scale modeling, which I think will be very helpful. One of the things that's been missing in the water use advisory, or excuse me, in the water use program, is actually getting a better understanding of some of the hydrologic systems that are being stressed pretty significantly with a lot of irrigation. So it'd be good to get some models and some strategic places developed, which will help us answer the questions as to how much water can we safely take for irrigation and other users, and where do we draw the line, or how, and that kind of understanding is going to be really critical to help manage our groundwater resources.
So there are existing databases. There's databases, for instance, for wellhead protection areas where communities are using public or groundwater for public water supplies. We have what is called the well logic system, where well drillers have to enter data about the strata and whatnot that they encounter when they're drilling wells. Josh mentioned the environmental mapper, another database. Are these databases integrated? And if not, why? And are we going to do that as part of the hydraulic framework?
It is important to pull these information sources together, and they're not integrated now. There's some of them need data to be verified to make sure that the data are good as they're being used. But it is important to pull them together. So that is part of the council's recommendations, is to pull together all these data sources and to verify where necessary the data. So this is an important step that is being proposed, and it really needs to happen.
So one question we have is a big question. Can federal funding passed in Congress be used to address some of these cleanup sites? And if so, is Michigan pursuing this?
Skip, you were breaking up on.
Yeah, you cut out at the beginning of
Oh.
that question, sorry.
Sorry about that. So the infrastructure money that is coming from the federal government, can any of that be used to address the sites of environmental contamination that we have? Probably not. Your
Well,
thoughts on this?
I'll tell you, I mean, currently there's, I think it's Senate Bill 565, which is actually from the ARP money from back in March, that they did carve out money for PFAS, to address PFAS contamination. And so, yes, so there are opportunities there. So we did comment on that bill to kind of help us use that money better as far as grant funding for for RD use to do some more cleanup work. So yes, we are poised to take advantage of that, and when those get proposed, we do try to carve out some money. But
And Josh, I don't know if this is in your purview, but we have a number of questions regarding the operation of concentrated animal feeding operations and the waste contribution from these facilities. Can you speak to that at all?
no, that is not in my purview. It's not in the cleanup program. What I keep telling people is already is, cleanup is only part of the story. The other half is prevention, right? And the more we can prevent all this stuff and get into environment, the better. Unfortunately, the programs that our division oversees don't regulate any of the prevention programs. It's strictly after release has occurred, the actions responsible parties are supposed to take, or the state takes, to abate the risks and try to contain the contamination. So no, I don't.
Ellen? Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to cut you off, Josh.
No, you're good.
Ellen, what about risks relating to waste management and nutrient management? Definitely an issue in Michigan. Are we particularly vulnerable, given being a peninsula surrounded by the Great Lakes, for these kinds of problems?
I think these problems are ubiquitous, and Michigan is as vulnerable as any other state with respect to CAFOs and the nutrient runoff. Again, it becomes part of the producers don't want to pollute their environment. I mean, it makes no sense on their part. It makes no sense on anybody's part. But sometimes in the case of CAFOs in particular, the manure and the pits are just so overfilled, they have nowhere else to apply it. So it becomes a resource management decision, and it's part of making sure that the nutrient management plans that these farms have can have enough sufficiency in planning for these kinds of exigencies that currently aren't handled appropriately. Now, one could argue stronger regulation might be able to address that. And certainly on the environmental side, people will make that argument. From the producer side, they would argue that they're doing the best they can. And it becomes, it's just one of these, very wicked problems that we face all the time in society. I'm not providing a defense for these CAFO operations that are violating our water standards. That they definitely should be held accountable. But on the other hand, we need to recognize that there's a lot of decision making that goes into these processes. This is, in most cases, this is more a surface water than a groundwater issue with respect to the CAFOs. And one thing that, from a technological perspective that we're pursuing right now is the ability to do microbial source tracking. So using that, we can identify where the source of the pollution is actually coming from. And that will provide advances in the future so that we can actually go back and figure out what the sources are, as opposed to just looking at them from a watershed or sub-basin level. That gives us more specificity, it gives us greater identity, and it also helps us in terms of management in implementing the best management practices to prevent this from being a problem in the future.
Yeah, so I understand this is primarily a surface water issue. One thing that we haven't touched upon that I think is really important, and I'm sure our viewers are interested about with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issuing the 6th assessment, our national climate assessment. What we know with reasonable certainty is that we will have more frequent and more severe storm events with more energy in the atmosphere, with higher temperatures, meaning higher moisture content in the atmosphere. We're going to have these storm events that are both more frequent and more severe. How does that affect, things like nutrient loading, sewer overflows, that sort of thing?
It's a major concern because our systems weren't built to handle these larger storms. And so as a consequence, we're going to get more, if there are combined sewers, we're going to have more combined sewer overflows. In addition, the best kind of recharge you're going to get into our aquifers is when you have a slow, steady rain. These large, deluges, a lot of it runs off, even if it's hitting undeveloped land. And as a consequence, our aquifers aren't going to be recharged to the greater degree than they would otherwise. So it's a combination of both quality and quantity that we're going to see as a function of these larger, more episodic events, whether it's snow or rain. And the climate change issue has multifold impacts, not just with respect to aquifer recharge, but we're going to see our growth zones change because it's going to be warmer in the southern climates. And so are these farmers going to now be moving north, and will they be extracting and demanding more water than they might otherwise do in, say, the Muskegon River watershed, or some of the other watersheds that are in this cool, cold water shift that we're seeing? And I think that's an issue that we all need to be aware of and plan accordingly. We need to start thinking ahead as to what this means for the future with respect to the climate impacts.
Andy, we have a question. I live near a contaminated site. The owner says they did a remedial action and Eagle sent them something called a, quote, no further action letter, unquote. What is that? Does that mean that the property is now safe and I don't need to worry about hazardous substances migrating toward my home?
That's a good question. The no further action letters, the title can be very misleading. If a party does any kind of a cleanup effort, even a very limited effort to deal with a small portion of the property or only one contaminant, and they do that part correctly, and they submit a letter to the department describing what they did. If they did that part correctly, then the department has to issue them a letter called a no further action letter. So just because a company received a no further action letter doesn't mean their whole contaminated site problem has been solved. It could just be a limited portion of it.
Okay. What about, we have a question about abandoned oil and gas wells in Michigan. Are those potential routes for further groundwater contamination, or is that not a concern?
I'm not sure any of us know the answer to that. If the proper procedures are followed, it shouldn't be a concern because the law requires that those be sealed when they're abandoned. I guess the question would be, are there unsealed wells? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think the assumption is that there are. In fact, nationwide, there's an estimated 3 million abandoned oil and gas wells that haven't been properly closed. And you know, typically that occurs, at least to the best of my understanding, when an oil and gas development company goes through bankruptcy or ceases operation, and you know, the responsibility to properly close those wells don't occur. So but the physical question of whether, you know, there are arteries, for lack of a better term, for, you know, contamination of aquifers, I just don't know the answer. Anybody having an idea?
No, I mean, like Dave said, if they're done properly, they shouldn't be. But you know, I'll make a plug for our oil and gas division, is that the Orphan Well Fund does need some some supplementing to take care of those, like you said, the ones in bankruptcy. But you know, we've run across old wells that, you know, were improperly plugged or inadequately plugged, that, you know, have spewed materials out during a redevelopment project. We did one in Muskegon where we ran across one with a wooden plug in it, and it just went, you know, and we had to take care of it. So there's always the potential, but
there is a quote orphan well fund unquote that helps us attend to this problem.
there is, but it is not adequately funded.
Your remediation division are picking on Muskegon County today. I got to tell you, as a resident here, I'm starting to feel a little violated.
Well, Muskegon County had a combination of very permeable sands and
Thanks,
very
Andy.
little clay protecting the aquifers, and a lot of chemical industry.
That's okay. No, you know, hey, it keeps us in business. That's okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, panelists. We're reaching the end of our allotted time. I'm going to turn this back to Liz and Kelly, but thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I just want to thank all of you for a tremendous conversation, presentation, just sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge. It's a real day where we get to celebrate groundwater and make the invisible visible. And you have all done that. Want to give a special thanks to Representative Koopa and to Skip for this wonderful moderation, these thoughtful questions. And I want to thank all of our participants for this really robust engagement. It's really what makes these conversations wonderful. We look forward to gathering again in person to make that interaction even more robust. And of course, I want to thank our incredible staff here at Flow. Special thanks to Kelly Thayer, our Deputy Director, and everyone. And we would be so thankful if you could just take a moment and click on to the survey link that is in the Zoom chat box. that helps us with our programming so that we can make sure that we bring programs that are relevant and meaningful to you and ensure that we do those deep dives. We're going to follow up with an email as soon as we can with a link to today's recording. Please do share it with others. Like this webinar on Facebook and social media platforms. And we will share links from our presenters. And I just want to end by wishing you all a wonderful World Water Day and gratitude to all of you. Thank you.